Hello guys, and welcome to another computer related video. Today's video is going to be about this machine I recently put together, and this is my Pentium-75 build. So it's based around Pentium, 75 megahertz Pentium, one of the earlier Pentiums, and tried to stick with kind of period parts. I wanted to make this sort of a mid-90s, maybe like a 1994 to 95 type of machine, with a focus, very heavy focus on DOS and 2D. So I wanted to try out some of those early PCI cards that were 2D only. So we weren't really looking at 3D acceleration or 3D games here. So this machine is capable of Windows 95, but Windows 95 for this build was sort of an afterthought. Like I said, the focus was just 2D DOS from the mid-90s, 94 to 95. Alright, so a little about this machine. This machine was kind of built out of the idea of something that sort of captured the feel and performance of the very first Pentium, so the socket 4 boards with the Pentium 60 and the Pentium 66. I've done a couple videos. I do have a socket 4 machine with the Pentium 66. I've done a couple videos on that. I'll try to put a link, I think it's that corner, to that video on that machine. I think I have 2 or 3 of those. But if anyone that's into computers and the hobby knows that socket 4 stuff is kind of hard to find, kind of expensive, and kind of unreliable. So I thought, what if I wanted to make a machine that was kind of had that same feel, but was not hard to put together and wasn't ridiculously expensive and was much more reliable. And basically what I came up with was this machine. So I kind of made this mostly out of parts I just had sitting around. Now the Pentium 75 was just kind of like the next bump up. It was the CPU that Intel came out with after the Pentium 66, and it was, a lot of people really see it as the first true Pentium. It really got rid of a lot of the issues that the Pentium 60 and 66 had. A lot more reliable, ran cooler. There's a lot of them made. They're super cheap and easy to find, and they work in socket 5 and socket 7 boards, which are getting hard to find, but not nearly as hard to find or as expensive as socket 4. So yeah, so this is the machine I put together. We're just kind of a fun project build. I'm just kind of gonna go over it. We'll look at a couple benchmarks, maybe look at some games. We'll talk about what's in this thing, and just have some fun looking at this build. Has a little LED. Yes, I have set that to display 75. Kind of cool. Power button, key for if you want to lock your system. Resets here, and the turbo button. Now the turbo function is pretty useless on a Pentium. I'm trying to think. I've never come across a Pentium machine that had a turbo button that would actually work. I've come across boards that had jumpers still for the turbo function, but when you hook them up, they do nothing. There may have been a few OEM machines that did do something to make the turbo work with a Pentium, but it's something about how the Pentium is just different enough that the turbo feature just doesn't work in most cases, as far as I know. Like I said, every board I've come across that was Pentium and it had a turbo connector for it to hook up a turbo button, it just did nothing. I think they were just there. They put them on most Pentium boards just so you had something to connect to, even though it did nothing. I might be wrong on that. If there's something I've been missing, let me know in the comments, but as far as I know, the turbo feature is pretty irrelevant for Pentium builds. Now I really wanted to put a 5 1/4 inch floppy in this. I think it would have been appropriate for the time period, but I couldn't, and I'll show you why right now actually. Right, so there's these two cutouts here. Unfortunately, this machine inside lacks the mounting bracket here. It's missing, so I can't actually mount anything here. So that's why I had to use this middle large bay here for the hard drive. Now the hard drive is, I believe, a 3 or 4 gigabyte drive, but thankfully the BIOS on this motherboard can detect larger hard drives, so I do get the full 2 gigabytes in DOS. Of course, we have our 1.4 megabyte floppy drive, and then we have our CD drive here. Unfortunately, I don't have any ERA CD drives. I don't have any ×4 or ×2 or ×8 drives, so I just went with this. The slowest one I actually had was a 32, but I don't really have a problem with that. So let's take a look inside now. Let's see the components I decided to go with. So here we see the inside with the case removed in its full glory, with all our cards installed. Now let's uninstall those cards. Oh, look at that magic, the cards disappeared, and so did my hand. So I did go with the socket 7 board. I tried to go with an earlier socket 7 board. I originally wanted to go with the socket 5 board just to do something a little different. But the only socket 5 board, if you guys remember from an earlier video, is this guy. Now originally this guy had a problem with it wouldn't go past post because of that damn real-time Dallas battery, which I actually removed and replaced it with a socket. But now even when I put in a working Dallas battery to replace it, it doesn't post anymore, and I've pretty much tried everything. Now I did notice there is a cap right there. I don't know if you'll be able to see it right there that's missing. I don't know when that went missing. Maybe when I was putting this on, I accidentally hit it and knocked it off. I thought maybe that was the problem, but after asking some people on some vintage computer forums and whatnot, they said that shouldn't affect it as far as posting goes. So I don't know what's wrong with this board. It might be just dead now. So anyways, back to this socket 7 board. Alright, so this socket 7 board is a PM8600, so PM8600. The maker of the board is, for some reason I can't remember, but it starts with an A, and all they have on the board is an A. Amptron or something like that. So yeah, it uses a Intel chipset, even though here it says VX2+, just a little sticker. It's an Intel chipset. On board it has ATA33, 4 PCI slots, 4 16-bit ISA slots, got built-in floppy controller, obviously, built-in IDE for 4 IDE devices. If you can see back here, we've got RAM. It supports both 72-pin and SD RAM. I think 168-pin SD RAM. I think it supports up to 512 megabytes. Of course, because I was kind of going for era correctness with this thing, I did not put that much in. Because I'm only focusing this on DOS 2D around the 94, 95 era, I think I just went with 32 megabytes of RAM, and I went with the old 72-pin RAM just because, you know, aesthetics, give it more that old-timey feel. I used the older RAM. I believe this is EDO RAM, so it does support EDO. Now the one thing I don't like about this board, see where this is a pretty common problem with these boards. Right here we have the CPU, and we have got this big hulking heatsink and fan on it. Now unfortunately, a lot of the cards, graphics cards, are a bit longer, and they actually won't fit in any of these 3 slots because they will hit this card, which is kind of an annoying problem. There are shorter ones, but a lot of these earlier PCI cards are kind of long, so they do end up hitting this thing. Now, I do have this guy, this fan card 2. No need for CPU fan. Even on a Pentium. I don't really trust this thing though. So what? That's weird. That's what? So and then I flip it and it's upside down. Are those boxes like that? Anyways, so yeah. Apparently with this card, you know, the theory would be is you would put it right here and it has fans and it would blow across the CPU, and that means you wouldn't need this. But I mean, the only reason you'd want to do that is you could put a card in one of these slots that was long enough that generally it would hit this thing. But if you put a card here that was, say, like this long, it's covering up part of the CPU, and when the fan is blowing on it, it's just hitting that card and being deflected, and like the other half of the CPU isn't getting cooled. That doesn't sound good. I don't know about that. Has anyone used one of these in the comments that would like to tell me what they think about these things? But yeah, blocks CPU mounted fan blocks up to 3 slots. Actually, that's exactly what it's doing here. The delicate internal bondings of the CPU should not be subjected to any long-term shaking or resonance. Most dealers attract comfort, blah, 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 blah. It's an interesting thing. I think I got this for like $1. But it's powered by the slot, so when I first saw this, I figured it had a little connector for like to hook up to the Molex from the PSU, but I guess the slot powers it. 2 fans. It actually has connections for like 2 more fans, so technically you could even use this maybe to mount like for case fans to connect to it. Interesting. Can even parts to solder in LEDs. So I really wanted to use this thing, but I don't know. Alright, so let's talk about the CPU. And to do that, I'm going to cut away to a video I shot much earlier. So excuse it if there's a drop in quality. So here's the star of our newest project. This is the 75 megahertz Pentium chip. Now, a lot of these chips that I've come across are all ceramic, but they did make some, as you can see here, that have the gold top, which I kind of like the gold top. It looks a little, I don't know, classier. It looks a little bit more like premium. It has a little bit more of like that old school feel of the, you know, the 60 and the 60 hertz megahertz Pentiums. But yeah, I think they made the 75, the 90, and the 100 megahertz Pentium with the gold top. But it seems like most of them I come across just have the, like this right here, it's just all ceramic. But yeah, this is our Pentium 75 with the gold top. So it's 75 megahertz. Now, it has I believe it's a 1.5 multiplier, so you'd have a 50 megahertz front side bus, and then you get 75 from that. It's a little bit weird. I think this is only one of 2 of the Pentiums that run on a 50 megahertz bus. Most of them at least run on the 66 megahertz bus. Alright, so now that we're back from talking about the CPU, let's look at the cards I decided to use with this thing. And now I'm looking at it, this lithium battery looks pretty nasty. Also, I forgot to point out, see, there's no way to mount anything here. Now, there's no metal here, so obviously, you know, it's cut out, and on here, these are removable. So obviously, you're supposed to be able to mount 2 3.5-inch drives there, but there's no, I don't even see a place that, you know, there should be like a little metal frame thing that would go here, and then you could mount the drives in, but there's nothing. So it's pretty much useless to me. So that's a shame. As a little bonus, if for changing the LED on this thing, it's pretty easy. You just unscrew these screws. The bottom too, and you just take this off, and you probably can't see it, but there's just a bunch of jumpers, and then you just keep it kind of hooked up to power, and you just play around with the jumpers. Like you move one or take one off, hit power, see what the LED says. You can kind of decipher how it works that way, since I couldn't find any like instructions on how to change the LED, but you can, it's not too hard to just figure it out by trial and error, just a little bit time consuming. So yeah, that's pretty neat. Alright, first card up we're going to talk about here is the video card I decided to use. Now, I wanted to go with something a little bit different. Of course, my go-to card for this machine for, you know, a Pentium 2D card would be the ET6000 from Sang Labs. It's the ET6000. That would really be my go-to card for this machine. And we'll look at some benchmarks later, but I did test a lot of like 2D PCI cards, and that did come up on top on pretty much all of my tests. But I wanted to go with something a little bit different. So this card gets, you know, thrown around sometimes in vintage CPU circles, and that's the ATI Mach 64. Now there's also a Mach 32 card. Basically the same thing. This one's a little bit more, has a little bit of tweaks to it, but they're basically the same. I think this one on general just has more RAM. That's the biggest difference. In my benchmarks, they seem to be identical as far as speed goes. But yeah, the ATI Mach 64. Now the Mach cards, the ISA and the VLB versions of these are pretty sought after, but from my testing, this is actually one of the slower PCI cards. Now, for 2D acceleration, so that's something like, say, if you're in Windows desktop and you're zooming around the desktop and stuff, it actually does pretty well in that respect. But as far as games go, this card can be pretty slow. Like I said, when I did my benchmarks, this thing came out slowest of the cards I tested. So yeah, it's not really a fast card. It's also supposedly not very compatible either. Now, I've run a couple games on this thing, and I haven't seen any kind of glitches or issues because of this card. But you know, if you look at charts and you talk to people about it, this card does tend to have, or at least it's said that this card has a bit more issues with like glitching in certain games. Probably a lot of things with like scrolling and commander keying. That seems to be an issue with ATI cards in general. So yeah, it's not the most compatible card. Certainly not the fastest, but you know, just for like general use, it hasn't been so horrible yet. And I really wasn't going for a speed demon with this build. I was just kind of putting a build together. I just wanted to use parts that were a little bit different than what I usually use. So yeah, I went with the Mach 64. I believe this is 2 megabytes, either 2 or 4 megabytes of RAM. Not quite sure, but yeah, not the fanciest card, but interesting nonetheless. And I wanted to go with something different. Alright, so now let's talk about sound. Now, originally I really wanted to go with something different, and I went with this thing at first. Now this is sort of a revision of the Yamaha Audition 32, but I believe this is a clone of that card. It's from Adonix. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right. I don't have it written down in front of me, just running off memory here. But it's basically, the layout's exactly the same as that Audition 32 card. Exactly. It uses the same FM OPL chip, so this thing gives you authentic OPL, FM, and DOS. Much cleaner sounding than a lot of Sound Blaster cards. I think the only difference I could find with this and the Audition 32 is it has this interesting little switch here for, it says 3D. So up is 3D, and it just says on and off. That is a really tough switch. So yeah, I believe the other ones you can use software for the 3D or simulated 3D audio. But this one just has a switch on it. But other than that, it's exactly the same. But I didn't decide to go with this card. I actually went with arguably a worse choice, but I just did this because it felt more like it belonged in the era, and I just went with the classic Sound Blaster 16. Yeah, a much noisier card. Whoop. This is a much noisier card, but you know, I like it. It works just fine, and it's big and kind of clunky, and it has the dial here for the volume, but I don't know. I just kind of like this card. This one isn't. This one has a DSP version 5.7, or is it 4.7? Anyways, this does have the hanging MIDI bug associated with it, where this one doesn't. So that's even more strikes against this card. But other than that, this card really, it just works. You know, I put it in, I install the driver, and I'm not saying that this one doesn't just work, but this one's just so easy to set up. Maybe that's just because I've installed Sound Blasters so many times. It just works. It just always works. I just put it in, run the installer program, and it just works. I know where ports everything's at, and even though this one does use jumpers because it's an older one, but yeah, I really like these cards, even though they're noisy and kind of boring, but they're so compatible. Neighbors' kids are screaming outside. I don't know. Hopefully, I don't know if that's a good thing if the mic's sensitive enough to pick that up, because in one way it's really annoying, but in the other way that means I don't have to worry about it. But if you hear random screaming, neighbors' kids running around. Now this one doesn't have the ASP chip. The vast majority of them you see won't. I don't have any with that chip, and I've actually never seen any with that chip. But you're not really missing out. There's exactly one game, I believe, that utilizes the ASP chip. It's a flight simulator game, experimental fighter program or something like that. I have it listed on the blog, but yeah, like one game uses that chip, so you don't really have to worry about that. I'm actually not too worried about the fact that this has the hanging MIDI bug, and I'll show you why in 1 second here. So, The reason I don't care about the hanging MIDI bug is because for this machine I actually had an extra MIDI controller card hanging out, and that's this guy. So this is the MQX32M, and this is a very interesting MIDI card. Now if you can see here, this actually has two Z80 chips, and that's because it can handle two MIDI sources. It's pretty much, most of the features of this card are completely irrelevant for gamers. It's really for people that are doing music stuff. So this card has a bunch of interesting features which I don't even understand what half of them do, but I can confirm that it does just work if you want an MPU compatible MIDI card. So basically I have this in the machine. I have this is what came with it. It has two ins and two outs. You just hook one of these up, and is it the in or the out? I forget. You just hook one of these up. I think it's that out. I don't know. It's confusing sometimes. I'll show you though when I hook it up. You hook one of those up, and it does work. It is almost 100% Roland, MPU 40 compatible. I believe some of the games from Origin it has problems with. So Wing Commander, this card has problems with. It will lock up in the intro. But this machine is way too fast to play Wing Commander anyways, so I'm not really worried about this. So for the era games this machine is meant for, which is like, end of the DOS era pretty much, this should be compatible with pretty much all of them. And it should also still be compatible with a majority of older games too. So I'm not really worried about the incompatibility with Origin games. If I want to play those, I'll play them on my 386 or 486 anyways, which also have MIDI cards, so I'm not real concerned about that. But yeah, this is an interesting card. Like I said, this is more for, I believe this was more for like music professionals doing music MIDI stuff rather than gamers. But yeah, you can use this if you have one for hooking up external MIDI devices like the MT32 or an SC55. So yeah, that's about it. Very simple machine. I haven't really filled it up with a ton of cards like I usually do. I just kind of wanted to go with something pretty basic. So yeah, basically got your video card and then sound card, and then this kind of go along with the sound card. So I have the Sound Blaster handling all the, the FM synthesis and digital sound effects like voices and stuff. And like I said, FM synth if I want to use that. And then this is handling all my MIDI via external MIDI devices. So I guess that's really about it. Pretty simple machine. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to put it all back together, and we're going to show you some benchmarks, and then we're going to just look at some games and then wrap it up. Alright, so it's hooked up basically just for a test run here. Now I have set up this machine and I've run it, and everything's run fine, although I haven't done it with the MIDI device hooked up through the sound card using the mixer to mix. I've tested both individually on this machine and they both worked fine, but will be the first time seeing if it'll work, with the sound mixed, which it should, because it's really not that complicated. So I'll just turn it on here. Oh wow. You know what the problem is? It needs plugged in. Alright, so let's try that again now that we've actually plugged the thing in. There we go. Nice 75 megahertz. Sounds good so far. And monitor kicked in. There we go. Alright, so we'll get back once I have things ready to start a game and see if if the mixing has worked. Yeah, you can really hear when your volume goes up. I really hate that. So I don't know, maybe I will switch. But even though this is a newer CD drive, the action of it's actually kind of, it feels like an older CD drive, how the action of it is with the opening. How this isn't attached, it just like drops down. I don't know, kind of like it. Alright, so the game I want to test real quick is Panzer General, which is a great game for this machine. Doesn't really tax it at all, but it's nice turn-based strategy sort of 2D game that is machine runs very nicely. But I've got the SC55, so let's see if it works. Now the thing is, now I mean, obviously it's like, oh, you don't need a Pentium to run that game. Well, yes, of course you don't, but it does run like very nice and smooth. And Panzer General is one of those weird games that seems to have a speed issue. I found even on a Pentium 90, the videos that play, like the FMV videos, they actually play a little too fast, whereas bump things down to a Pentium-75 and they feel just right, and the gameplay is really smooth. It's not a game breaker. I mean, who cares if the videos are a little bit fast, but still, it's something to know. Okay, let's see if the sound mixing worked here. Well, it's playing... Oh, cool. It's so noisy though. But, I mean, it's working. Sort of. No, there's instruments missing. I think. It definitely doesn't sound right. Alright, I think I found a problem, and it was extremely simple. Where the speaker connected to the sound card in the back was very loose. So I disconnected it, and I just reconnected it, and made sure it was a really good connection. And that seems to have fixed a lot of the problems. It's still, if you turn up really high, it's still noisy, but not nearly as bad. So it's got a much better connection. I think it's not picking up all that interference. So let's try it now. It sounds a lot better. I think. Yeah. So, again, sorry for the... I guess I could have mounted it on something, but I didn't think this was going to be so involved.
First mission in Operation Fall Vice,
okay, yeah, I mean, it's still a little noisy, but this sounds
by September 10th.
A lot better. So that sounds a lot better, and it's mixing it. It seems like everything's pretty much correct. I haven't played this game a terrible amount, but I think that sounds just fine. Again, it is a little bit more noisy than I'd like it to be, but that's just the nature of those early Sound Blaster 16. So, oh, and by the way, it's the out one, and it's because obviously it's coming out of the computer MIDI card and then in, so the out to the in on the thing. Yeah. I've done this like literally like 50 times, and I still get confused sometimes. And yeah, there's Rattle Me Bones.
Rattle Me Bones!
It's because a Rattle Me Bones is awesome, and it should be in everyone's computer collection on a really ghetto shelf. So yeah, okay, so let's just look at some benchmarks now, and then let's look at some gameplay. Alright, so this is just a quick chart of some benchmarks I did with some 2D PCI cards. These were performed on that same motherboard, but they were done when I was experimenting with CPUs, and I had a 90 megahertz Pentium in there, so not too different. But I don't want to linger on this chart too long because it's just kind of a bonus thing I had put together. Didn't really even intend it for this video, but here it is. So I tested a small selection of 2D, remember these are 2D only PCI cards, and as just, I guess the main takeaway from this is the ET6000, as expected, did score the highest. It didn't crush the other cards, but it generally scored as well or higher in all the tests, while the Mach 64 scored generally the lowest. I think it did score noticeably the lowest in all the tests, except maybe PCP Bench at 320 by 200. It looks like it still scored lower, but not like ridiculously lower. Still certainly playable and usable frame rates. It's not that the card was garbage or you couldn't do it. It just wasn't as overkill as the other cards. I also did test the Mach 32, but it was statistically identical to the 64. So the other cards I tested were S3 Vision 8 868 and a 968, which were pretty similar. Actually, the 868 seemed to score a little higher in a lot of situations than the 968. An S3 Verge, I know that's a 3D card, but it does have the same 2D card as the Trios, I believe. Although they may be slightly different. The one in the Verge might be a little bit tweaked. I don't know for sure, but yeah, it scored pretty well too. Not as well as the ET6000. And then a weird IGS card that I have. If you've never heard of IGS, I'm not surprised. I hadn't really either, and this is the only card I've seen come across from them. It looks very generic. They were a graphics card company, I guess, for a while. They might have made other things too, but yeah, this IGS card actually doesn't do too bad, and this card's always worked. Any machine I've ever put it in, it's worked. I kind of use it as my testing card. If I get a new board and I put cards in it and I can't seem to get an image, I'll put this IGS card in it. It seems to almost always work. So yeah, it's a decent performer. But yeah, just a really quick, small selection of 2D PCI cards tested on this specific board. So yeah, the Mach 64 and 32, they're just, like I said, they're not unusable. They're still scoring decent. You know, everything is certainly playable, or at least as playable as the other cards, it seems, but it's just not as overkill as the other cards. So don't discount the Mach 32 or 64, just know that it isn't the fastest option. Alright, so here we have a direct comparison between my Socket 4 66 MHz Pentium machine and the 75 MHz Pentium machine that we saw on the Socket 7 board. These are both running the Mach 64. So yeah, here's the results. I was a little bit curious since the 75 MHz, you know, it's a newer chip. It's running at a faster clock speed, but the front side bus overall is a little bit slower. The 75 MHz Pentium one was running on that 50 MHz front side bus, and the chip itself has a 1.5 multiplier, whereas the Pentium 66, everything's just running at 66 MHz front side bus. But despite a little bit faster front side bus, the 75 MHz Pentium 1 system did win pretty much all the tests, every single one. Some not as much as others. Alright, but let's take a quick look real quick. First we have some synthetic benchmarks. 3D Bench 1.0C and PCP Player at 320 by 200. And in both of these tests, the 75 MHz is noticeably ahead. It seems like these synthetic benchmarks, the gap between whatever you're testing seems to be bigger than when you're just playing games. Maybe that's just me, but it just seems that way. So Wolfenstein 3D, they both do very well in the game. They both pull over 60 frames per second, but they're pretty close. What is that, like a 1 or so frame per second difference, 1 or 2 frames, pretty close there. Doom, we do have the 75 MHz machine pulling ahead by like 5 or 6, maybe 7 frames. It is noticeable there. Quake at 320 by 200, again about 5 frames give or take difference, and then Quake again at 360 by 480, so a higher resolution. Not quite as big of a gap, but we still have the 75 MHz machine pulling a couple frames ahead. Okay, and now here we have, I've added the Socket 4 66 MHz Pentium 1 machine, how I originally had it set up with the ET6000, just to get an idea of what kind of impact different video card may make. And here you can really see here it's evident that the card does have a bit of a speed advantage over the Mach 64. Now, something kind of interesting to note here, when I did my 2D testing, it was on the same motherboard that I used for the 75 MHz machine, but at the time I had a 90 MHz Pentium in there, and all the cards worked fine. But once I switched over to the 75 MHz Pentium, for some reason a lot of cards just stopped working. Actually, the only 2 cards, well 3 cards that would display after switching CPUs was the Mach 32 and 64 and that IGS card. All of the S3 cards, including the Verge, as well as the ET6000, would fail to display. I went through the BIOS, I tried a lot of things. I thought maybe it was some kind of weird IRQ conflict. There's an option in BIOS to assign IRQ to the VGA card. Nothing seemed to work. So I haven't tested this theory yet by going back and putting the 90 MHz CPU back in and testing it again. But the only thing I can really think of maybe is some of those cards don't like the 50 megahertz front side bus, because that's really the only thing I can think that changed. It's just the front side bus and the CPU, but I'm not sure about that. But I don't know, just a weird little thing. I'm sure I've seen these cards working in Pentium-75 machines, so I don't know exactly what was going on there. But yeah, so here we go. This just illustrates the difference with a different video card. Yeah, the ET6000 really pulls ahead in some of these tests anyways, like Wolfenstein 3D. In Doom, we still have the 75 megahertz beating the 66 megahertz with the Mach 64, but the difference isn't quite as great. Alright, so the first game I'm looking at here is Panzer General. This game plays, as I said earlier, pretty correctly on this machine. I felt these little intro, these little videos, that right there, that freeze, that's an issue with the capture card. It's not actually the game. When you're sitting playing the game, it actually runs fine. So that's a capture card issue. But yeah, I found like even on a Pentium 90, it runs a little bit too fast. Even on this machine, certain spots, it's weird. Certain spots seem like it runs a little too fast, like maybe some of the videos, or you know, like transitioning between scenes at some spots, and then some parts still feel like horribly slow, like the battles. But the battles in this game always felt slow, it seems, regardless on what you play it on. But yeah, this is sort of a kind of a game that maybe this machine would really excel at, because there's no 3D, it's just 2D turn-based. I'm not saying the early Pentiums are like slouches and you have to play like 2D slow turn-based games. No, we'll see some first-person shooters, the obligatory first-person shooters, in a minute, but yeah, games like this they play really well. They're not really a problem for it at all. But like I said, there is some like weird spots in this game where it just feels either slightly too fast or slightly too slow, but that's really, really nitpicking. The other thing, I'm sorry for the horrible kind of quality. It almost looks like S-Video, but I'm using a really high-end capture card. I've mentioned this in my other videos in the past. I just do not know how to set these things up and optimize them. I'm really considering just I've seen some other YouTubers just, when they do old DOS games, they just set up an LCD and they just kind of directly take footage from that. It seems to work out pretty well. Might be actually a better option than direct capture for these older games. Alright, so let's move on to our next game here. Alright, so here's another type of game this machine really seems to excel at least with the Mach 64. This is Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers. I have no idea what I'm doing here. I just kind of put this on to see if it would work, and I'm just clicking around sort of aimlessly. I do like my point-and-click adventure games, but I want to wait when I can really like sit down and really play this game. So this was just an example to see how well it ran, and it seems to run just fine. But like I said, I didn't read any of the intro or storyline, so I don't know what's going on. I'm just sort of clicking around to see how well it plays, which it does seem to play just fine. I know this is a pretty advised or well-regarded game, and I do hope to play it one day, maybe in my Adventure Game Time series, which no one watched or rather listened to. It's more of a podcast thing, but it's so hard to coordinate with people. Who knows when the next one will be, if ever. But yeah, this game, I didn't really see any issues with this game. It installed and seemed to play just fine for the little bit I played of it, at least. Alright, so here's another kind of point-and-click adventure game I really hope to play one of these days, and this is Prisoner of Ice. I did try to find games from around the time period, so I believe this is 95. The other ones were mid-90s-ish as well. Look at this game kind of surprised me. I thought it was more... I don't think the characters are sprites. They're almost like, I don't want to say computer animated, because it's not a computer, but they seem a little bit more like 3D. Than sprites. They just have an interesting look to them, but I love Lovecraftian sort of stuff, so this looks like a game that is right up my alley. I'd really love to play, hopefully one of these days. So yeah, again, it seemed to play just fine on this machine. Again, I didn't go too far into it. I just kind of wanted to see if it would play, which it did. And I kind of promptly die here at the beginning because I have no idea what I'm doing. This weird monster thing comes out of the door and kills me. So I suppose when I do a proper run through this game, I will have to figure out how to get past him. With I have no mouth but I must scream, I couldn't install it. I just kept getting this weird error. It could be the disc that has an issue with it. I don't know. And see how that all these errors, even the sound you hear, that's my capture stuff. It looks and sounds just fine, you know, sitting there playing the game on the main PC. But like especially reds, like have seizures on my capture cards. Like I said, I don't know how to optimize this stuff. So usually it ends up looking like crap and sounding like crap too. Alright, now for the obligatory shooters to show off here. Now I'm running this game on the highest detail levels, and I pretty much have the full screen going here. All the little reds at the bottom are having seizures. Again, as I said just a minute ago, that's my capture devices and my poor ability to optimize, not the actual game. It looks just fine on the main system that I'm playing it on. But yeah, this game runs perfectly fine. Of course, it's Pentium-75. It's going to run just fine, even with a good bit of enemies on screen. Alright, so here we have Duke Nukem Atomic Edition, and this is a game, it's a little bit more stressing. Now as you can see from the intro here, it seems to struggle a little bit, and the gameplay isn't completely smooth, but just keep this in mind, I am running at the highest settings, so I'm running an SVGA, so it's a little bit higher. I believe the resolution's a little bit higher. You can smooth all this out really easy by just lowering the detail level and the resolution, and lowering it down to VGA off SVGA. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, this game runs fine, but like I said, I usually like to kind of stress the system, so I like to see how it runs with all the settings maxed. And I mean, it's still completely playable. Again, everyone has different tolerance levels for frame rates, but I think this game runs perfectly fine. But if it doesn't suit your needs, you can just turn down the detail levels and it should run a lot smoother for you. Alright, and finally we have Quake here. Now I did set this down to pretty much the lowest available resolution, just because Quake can be a lot to handle even for these early Pentium systems, even though it was kind of tailor-made for the Pentium. And it seems to run okay. I did run into an issue with this machine where it would just kind of like momentarily lock up, like things would kind of freeze up. Sometimes it was just for like a second or two. And then it would go back to normal. It didn't happen enough where you could say it made the game unplayable, but it was noticeable. It did happen from time to time. I'm not sure why. I restarted the system and to see if maybe it was just something like a reboot would fix, and it did the same thing again. Again, it's not my capture devices causing the issue, because it's a completely separate computer doing that, and it seemed to do that even when nothing was hooked up to it for capturing. So I'm not sure what the issue was. Maybe it was just the game was too stressing, because it did seem to do it more when there was a lot going on. Enemies, it happened, I'll show you in a clip real quick, like kind of the beginning of section 2. Here, it did it just now. See, and that was only for a second. There wasn't even any enemies or anything going on. But yeah, sometimes it did it and it was worse than other times, but I'm not really 100% sure why it was doing that. But other than that, the game was playable. Remember, this was in software mode, this machine, you might be able to just throw in a more powerful 3D, just throw in any 3D accelerator card. Just remember, I was using a 2D card, and you might get much better results. So again, you could pair this thing up with a Voodoo 1 or 2. You could throw in a TNT2 or heck, any PCI card you want, really. So there you go. Keep in mind, later PCI cards might have DOS incompatibilities. Hell, even period. PCI cards, every card has its own sort of pluses and minuses, but yeah, you could. That's an option. Like, see here, it really seems to chug right here, and I mean, it doesn't seem there's not like a horrible amount of stuff going on, but that's just the issue I ran into with this game. If anyone knows why it might be doing that, let me know in the comments. But maybe it's just, I don't even remember the specs for this game, if it was meant to run on a Pentium 90 or higher. I don't remember. I think the case just says a Pentium, so it seems to just want Pentium power. So yeah, there's Quake. So is there really any reason to specifically seek out or build a Pentium-75 machine? I would say no. There really isn't a specific reason to build or have this kind of machine. It just seems that if you really want to go for something retro, or you want to put together an older PC from around, the early 90s, it might be more fun and interesting just to build a 486. And if you did want to build an earlier Pentium, or Pentium for some later DOS stuff, you probably want to go with something a little more powerful. Pentium 133, even up to a Pentium 200 or 233, because that bit of extra power can really help, especially if we get into the really late DOS games, if you want to play them in a little bit higher resolutions, SVGA and that kind of thing. Now, that is not to say there's no reason to build one of these. If it's all the parts you have, sure, it's a very perfectly serviceable machine. It works fine. And maybe you had a Pentium-75 or something like it when you were younger, and you want to build one out of nostalgia. That is also fine. It's awesome. The machine works pretty well. It will play a large amount of games from that time period. And remember, you can always do things to beef it up. I was just playing around with early PCI 2D cards. You could get a lot more use and power out of it putting in a more powerful graphics card. You could even throw in something like a Voodoo 2 or a Voodoo 1 to complement a 2D card, or you can just throw in a later, all-in-one. Throw in a Voodoo 3 PCI or Voodoo Banshee or something like that. Even a PCI TNT2 or something along those lines if you want a lot more power. So just remember, you can make it more powerful. Now, as for the goal, yeah, I think we did pretty good. I did think it was around the power, a little bit more powerful, but it was around that sort of area of the Pentium 60 and 66 without a lot of the issues, especially the cost. This machine was a lot cheaper and would be a lot cheaper to put together, than a Pentium 60 or 66 machine, with a lot less issues, and it does provide fairly similar performance. It's in the ballpark. A little more powerful, but it's in the ballpark. Like I said, you can make this machine slower too if you wanted, without too much work. I don't know, that Mach 64 seems like a pretty slow card. You could always throw in an ISA video card if you wanted to slow it down more. Or if there's just an ISA card you prefer. Also, it's a little bit more work, and they're getting a lot harder to find, it seems, but a Socket 5 board might be something to build this machine around just for fun. There's really no reason to pick Socket 5 over Socket 7. Socket 7 is just cheaper, more available. It's easier to work with a little bit. They're not too dissimilar. But Socket 5 it's a little bit different. And I suspect that you might get slightly slower results depending on the chipsets, but I'm not sure about that. So yeah, so that's my opinion on the Pentium-75 machine. I had fun with it. I had fun putting it together, and there's a lot of games it plays pretty good. Especially, some of the games might stress, some of those first-person shooters when there's a lot going on, it might stress it a little bit, but you can always fix that by turning down the resolution a little bit, or like I said, just putting in a more powerful graphics card or a 3D accelerator would certainly help. So thanks again for joining me with another video, and have a good one, guys.